and the cold genocide of Falun Gong practitioners on the anniversary of the Genocide Convention and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Through video presentations and roundtable discussions, we turn our attention to the ongoing persecution and forced organ harvesting of Falun Gong, a most heinous and insidious crime against humanity that has become one of the most ignored genocides of the 21st century. This event is designed to educate and inspire. It creates space for open discussion about these human rights and medical atrocities, offering a clear overview and practical solutions to prevent further abuse. Let us work together to stop forced organ harvesting and those involved. Today, on the anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, our speakers will reflect on the Chinese Communist Party's persecution of Falun Gong practitioners, their efforts to destroy this spiritual practice, and their weaponization of medicine that has enabled a concealed and largely undetected genocide. Before we begin, please allow me to welcome our audience that is watching us on live stream via Epoch TV, NTD TV, and Ganjing World. Thank you for joining us today. Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting, or DAFOH for short, is an international NGO based in Washington, D.C. that was founded by medical doctors in 2006 when the news first broke of evidence forced organ harvesting in China. DAFOH's mission is to inform and educate the international medical community, governments, and the public about forced organ harvesting and the unending human rights crisis in China. DAFOH has published numerous independent reports and research on forced organ harvesting and has been nominated 3 times for the Nobel Peace Prize. In 2019, DAFOH received the prestigious Mother Teresa Award for Social Justice. Let us now hear from our distinguished speakers, experts in their professional fields. Our first speaker is Benedict Rogers, who has had many prestigious roles and regularly briefs senior government officials, as well as the European Union and United Nations officials on human rights and freedom of religion in Asia. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our speaker.
Hello, I'm Benedict Rogers. I'm the Senior Director of Fortify Rights. I'm the co-founder and chair of Hong Kong Watch, and I'm also the co-founder and chair of the Conservative Party Human Rights Commission. And I'm also an advisor to various organizations, including the Interparliamentary Alliance on China, and I had the privilege of being on the advisory board for ETAC for some time. About 10 years ago, almost exactly 10 years ago, I first learned about the full extent and the sheer horror of the crime against humanity that the Chinese Communist Party has been perpetrating for many years now, and that is the crime of forced organ harvesting. I was contacted initially by Ethan Gutmann, who I then invited to testify to the Conservative Party Human Rights Commission at its inquiry into human rights in China in 2016. And as a result of his testimony, Ethan Gutmann, of course, is the author of the well-known book on this topic, The Slaughter. As a result of his testimony, we then held a further specific inquiry into this topic of forced organ harvesting, where we heard evidence from Ethan Gutmann, from David Matus, from David Kilgore, from Anastasia Lin, and from other experts and campaigners on this issue. And over the years, this has been an issue that I have tried to help support advocacy on. I engaged in conversations with Sir Geoffrey Nice, KC, the British barrister, in around about 2017, when I first asked him if he would look at this issue and provide a legal opinion. And that, at least in part, is how the 2019 independent tribunal, the China Tribunal into Forced Organ Harvesting, came about. So in a small way, I helped to initiate that significant tribunal, which then in 2019 produced its independent judgment, concluding that forced organ harvesting is indeed happening, that it amounts to a crime against humanity, and that, in its own words, the words of its judgment, people who engage with the Chinese state should do so in the knowledge that they are engaging with a criminal state. Since the China Tribunal, advocacy on this issue has continued. We now see evidence that children in China may be targeted for forced organ extraction. And we've also seen earlier this year the mic incident between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, where they talked about ways to prolong their lives. And that suggests to me that people at the very top of the Chinese Communist Party are complicit with this barbaric crime, not only complicit in terms of allowing it to happen, but perhaps even in some cases being active participants or recipients of forced organ extraction, beneficiaries of forced organ harvesting from prisoners of conscience. So for all these reasons, I really welcome Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting and its decision to hold this two-day conference titled Bringing the World Together Against Forced Organ Harvesting and Human Rights Abuses in China. I'm sorry that I can't be with you in person. I'm currently traveling, but I'm pleased at least to be able to record this message to express my support for all your efforts and my promise to continue to speak out on this issue and to make sure that the international community doesn't forget that this is happening, that it pays attention to further developments on this issue, and most importantly, that it takes action. We need to encourage and urge countries around the world to stop organ tourism, to stop their citizens traveling to China for forced organ transplants. We need to look at ways that we can hold the perpetrators of this barbaric crime accountable. And we need to hold up the recommendations of the China Tribunal to ensure that they're not simply swept under the carpet, but that governments engage with those recommendations and with the evidence that has been provided. What is so significant about the China Tribunal, I should add, is that this was a body of distinguished people, chaired, of course, by Sir Geoffrey Nice, KC, a prominent British barrister who prosecuted Slobodan Milosevic, but consisting also of leading medical experts, other legal experts, and other academics and specialists in other disciplines. But what's so significant about it is that none of them had a prior involvement with this issue, or indeed, I think I recall, with the exception of one member who is an academic specializing in China, the other panelists didn't even have a prior engagement with the issue of human rights in China. So none of them could be accused of having a bias or a prejudged agenda. They all came at this topic with a genuinely open mind, with genuine independence, and reached their conclusions on the basis of the evidence that was presented to them. And that, I think, it makes the China Tribunal incredibly important. And it's the responsibility of all of us at this conference and beyond to make sure that the judgment of the China Tribunal, now 6 years old, doesn't just sit on a shelf, but actually serves as a manifesto for action. So I wish you every success over the next 2 days and beyond. I'll be advocating and campaigning alongside you as I have over the last 10 years. And I hope that together we can finally stop this horrific crime against humanity of forced organ harvesting and all the other related human rights violations, including the persecution of Falun Gong, the persecution of the Uyghurs, Tibetans, Christians, and others for their religious beliefs and for their freedom of expression. Let's get to work to stop these atrocities and to work to see a day when China and all its people are free and can live without fear. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Benedict Rogers, for your remarks. Our next speaker is Judge Song Kim. In addition to her role as a district court judge in South Korea, she has served as a visiting professional to the International Criminal Court and is an active member of the International Human Rights Law Research Association under the Supreme Court of Korea. Please join me in welcoming our speaker.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, It is an honor to speak at this seminar marking the anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Nearly 20 years have passed since I first encountered the shocking reports of forced organ harvesting in China. What remains most painful is that this grave crime has still not ended. Today, I'll briefly share Korea's experience and the evidence related to this issue. But my main focus is on what must come next, how the international community must now move from awareness to coordinated international and transnational action to prevent and combat forced organ harvesting. Forced organ harvesting from prisoners of conscience, most notably Falun Gong practitioners, is a crime of extreme brutality. But Korea is not merely an outside observer of this tragedy. Through transplant tourism, Korea has been directly and systematically entangled in this crime. A 2016 US medical study identified South Korea as the second largest source country for overseas organ transplants, with China as the main destination. Several Korean media investigations also reveal that large numbers of Korean patients were traveling to China for organ transplants with extremely short waiting times. My own legal analysis further confirmed the extreme abnormality of Chinese transplant tourism. Among about 70 Korean organ trafficking criminal cases, most cases involved brokers to China, with some brokers committing dozens of illegal transactions. The so-called donors were unidentified Chinese individuals or prisoners, and the waiting period was often just 3 weeks, medically impossible in any ethical system. Confronted with these realities, Korean civil society, particularly organizations such as KAEOT, has worked for more than a decade with partners including DAFOH to raise public awareness and push for legal reform. These efforts led to an important amendment in 2020. Korean law now requires patients who receive transplants abroad to report their transplant to the Ministry of Health. This was designed to end the legal invisibility of transplant tourism. However, not a single case has been reported to date. This reveals a difficult but critical truth. National legislation alone is not enough when the crime itself is transnational and systematically hidden. Public awareness has risen not only in Korea but across the world. Parliaments throughout North America and Europe have passed resolutions condemning forced organ harvesting. Most recently, the Falun Gong Protection Act was passed by the U.S. House of Representatives. These developments are meaningful, but we must now move beyond fragmented domestic action toward coordinated international responsibility. This November, 15 countries issued joint statements condemning China's human rights violations. The next step must be to elevate this issue to the institutional level of the United Nations, particularly the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly. International law is clear. States do not merely have the right to act, they have the duty to act. Under international law, all states are legally obligated to cooperate to bring to an end serious crimes such as genocide and crimes against humanity. This duty is now recognized as part of customary international law. This means that when such crimes occur, other states must not recognize the situation as lawful, must not assist in maintaining it, and must actively cooperate, primarily through collective action such as UN resolutions. We can see this clearly in state practice today. The international response to Russia's war crimes in Ukraine shows that this duty to cooperate is real and actionable. The UN General Assembly condemned the aggression, and the Human Rights Council adopted 2 resolutions to condemn the crimes and launched investigations. Another critical international mechanism is the UNTOC, the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, and its protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, also known as the Palermo Protocol. Forced organ harvesting in China represents the most extreme form of human trafficking for the purpose of organ removal. Yet, remarkably, this issue has never been systematically addressed within UNTOC's action plans or conference resolutions. Encouragingly, in 2024, the U.S. State Department's Trafficking in Persons report explicitly identified China's forced organ harvesting as a prime example of organ removal trafficking. The same year, KAEOT, the Korean NGO, participated as a panelist in UNTOC's constructive dialogue, addressing the forced organ harvesting issue directly within the treaty framework. Together, this development shows why the UNTOC approach is so important. It is practical, action-oriented, and less political, focusing on real investigations and law enforcement cooperation. When combined with the moral force of the human rights and genocide framework, it creates a far stronger path for international action. China is a party to the Genocide Convention and is bound by the strongest rules of international law. But in reality, there is still no effective international court process to hold the Chinese government legally accountable, mainly because the major international courts, such as the ICJ and the ICC, do not have clear jurisdiction over this situation. But this does not absorb the rest of the world. When crimes shock the conscience of humanity, international law requires collective responsibility. States must use every lawful tool available, especially collective action through UN resolutions, along with legislation, sanctions, universal jurisdiction, diplomatic pressure, and treaty mechanisms. If the world turns away now, we are not only abandoning the victims, we are allowing a failure of the international legal order itself, because every state has a legal duty to cooperate and to take all lawful measures to bring the atrocity to an end. To remain silent is not just a moral failure, it is a failure to uphold international law. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Judge Kim, for sharing these ideas on actions we should take. Our next speaker is Dr. Weldon Gilcrease, Medical Director of the Huntsman Cancer Hospital at the University of Utah and Deputy Director of Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting. Please join me in welcoming our speaker.
In October of 2022, the International Society of Heart and Lung Transplantation issued a statement on transplant ethics condemning forced organ harvesting in China. In it, they stated that they would no longer accept for publication any papers on transplant medicine coming from China, given that the likely source of those transplants was the state-sanctioned killing of innocent, non-consenting prisoners of conscience. In July of 2023, the Association of American Physicians and Surgeons also published a statement condemning forced organ harvesting in China. They called on the U.S. government and American physicians and surgeons to stop training Chinese physicians and surgeons in transplant medicine at the risk that they could be involved in complicity with these criminal acts. With two prominent medical societies recognizing forced organ harvesting and condemning the practice, why has there remained such a pervasive and persistent culture of silence within the medical community? I'd like to examine three factors. First, the belief that the practice stopped in 2015. This belief is based on a statement made by a Chinese transplant surgeon in December of 2014, promising that they would stop using executions as their primary organ source by January 1st, 2015, and they would rely on a brand new organ donation system. However, there's two major problems with this statement. First, the data doesn't support it. The data has shown that China manipulates their donor registry numbers, which remain very, very low and not sufficient to supply a huge amount of limitless organs that we see still occurring throughout China. In other words, they are still able to do transplants virtually on demand. The second problem with this statement is the problem of saying that this happened, but we should just move on. This goes against the very fabric and the DNA of the medical community. We must continue to examine ourselves, especially when it involves the harm of any patient or any person by the medical community. In China, countless lives have been taken in operating rooms under the weight and at the command of the evil and rogue Chinese Communist Party. We must not move forward and not examine how we got there. How did the medical system become an arm of the Chinese Communist Party? How did Falun Gong practitioners, the primary organ source, and really the victims that built the organ transplant system within China, how did they become so dehumanized and so victimized by the Chinese Communist Party and the transplant community within China? How did the practice of Falun Gong, which centers on truth, compassion, and tolerance, a peaceful Buddhist-like practice, how did this become such a threat to the Chinese Communist Party? And how did the Chinese Communist Party, how were they able to use the transplant system to do its bidding? If we simply move on, how do we ensure that this never happens again? How do we ensure that medicine is never corrupted again under the hands of a totalitarian system? The second major factor in the pervasive silence, as I see it, is the competing interests, and specifically the competing interest of financial interest and academic interest. In 2019, after the China Tribunal published their statement that unanimously and sure beyond reasonable doubt forced organ harvesting had happened in China and was continuing to happen in China, with Falun Gong being the primary victim group, I approached the leadership at my medical institution. When I met with one of our key leaders, I was told there was no doubt forced organ harvesting could and was happening in China, but that if we took any kind of stance, China would simply stop sending all of their students to our university. In this, he was referring to the undergraduate and graduate students at our university. In other words, we stood to lose a large financial interest by our university. The third factor with the silence is fairly simple, and it's a continued complete lack of awareness. With nearly 20 years and thousands of pages of data, the medical community and the transplant community remains largely unaware. I would still estimate that less than 10% of the entire medical community, and maybe slightly higher than that in the transplant community, knows what forced organ harvesting is, has some idea of what the thousands of pages of data show. In fact, if you look at medical schools, if you look at school curricula, if you look at medical ethics curricula, if you look at meetings and conferences, forced organ harvesting is simply a topic that is ignored. In fact, Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting tried to have a booth and a presence at the American Transplant Congress in 2024 and the World Transplant Congress in 2025, as we have in the past, and we were simply not invited. We were told we weren't welcome because the meeting was, quote, moving in a different direction. With leadership that want to censor the information that we have and the data that's out there, how do you have a population within the medical community that remains aware? In conclusion, although many doctors and the two medical societies that I mentioned and many governments have spoken up and spoken out against forced organ harvesting in China, the medical community largely remains silent. How do we break through this silence? How do we ensure public trust, which is at an all-time low? I think we must have the moral courage to take a stance and stand up and speak out against forced organ harvesting as a medical community. We must have the tenacity and go back to our basics of looking at data objectively, looking at data thoroughly, and coming to the conclusion, as I have, that forced organ harvesting continues in China and it continues unabated. We must hold the Chinese transplant system to the same scrutiny that the United States transplant system is held and every other transplant system in the legitimate medical world. We must not take financial or academic interest over the concerns for genocidal acts that are being carried out in transplant systems throughout China in a transplant system that was largely trained and built up by the United States and the Western world. And we must not stop raising awareness until every doctor and every surgeon has an awareness of the realities of this gruesome and horrific practice of forced organ harvesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gilcrease, for sharing your personal experience with us. Next, I would like to present Cornelia Kaminski, an author and pro-life activist. She's known for her commitment to human rights and to raising awareness of medical and bioethical issues. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our speaker.
When people talk about human rights today, they often treat them as a neutral, secular invention of the 20th century. But the very idea that every human being has an inviolable dignity and worth does not fall from the sky in 1948. It grew for centuries in the soil of biblical faith and Christian reflection. Without the conviction that every person is created in the image of God and loved by God, the modern language of universal and equal rights would be very hard to justify. This language used by secular human rights activists would make little sense without the older Christian inheritance of universal dignity and moral obligation. Christianity flourished from the start because the believers took this message seriously. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. Love your enemy. Do good unto those who harm you. In a society in which women, slaves, children, disabled and sick people were at the bottom of society, where their lives were worthless, the love and friendliness with which Christians not only treated each other, but everyone, was highly attractive. So, a tiny group of followers, maybe 100 at the time of Christ's death, quickly developed into a mass movement. These Christians were loyal to their God, loyal to each other. And although Christ had told them to render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's and unto God that which is God's, this, to the Roman authorities, was not enough. Roman religion was closely tied to public order and loyalty to the state. Christians, who worshipped only one God and rejected all other cults, refused to take part in these sacrifices. So they were seen as dangerous to the common good. Relentless persecution started. Christians could be tortured to force a sacrifice. They could be thrown to wild animals in the arena, crucified or burned alive. The persecutions only ended with the Edict of Milan of 313, in which Constantine granted full religious freedom to all Christians and all others. So to this day, the freedom of religion is one of the cornerstones of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Emperors, who until then had attacked the Church, now began to support it. And the Church made good use of this new freedom. Christian theologians gradually developed language that sounds remarkably like human rights, that the wealth of the rich is in some sense owed to the poor, that punishment must be humane, that every person is a subject of justice and not merely an object of power. Wherever Christianity took root deeply, it pushed societies toward valuing the weak, restraining cruelty, and building institutions that protect the vulnerable. Even communism, which is officially atheistic, quietly borrows the key Christian intuition that one must care about others and not only oneself. So the communist ideal of a classless society where exploitation ends presupposes that human beings have a moral duty to seek justice for others, not merely to maximize their own power or wealth. So communism too has the Christian rhetoric of solidarity and concern for the oppressed, but cuts it loose from its atheistic roots and from the idea that the state itself is under judgment. Without an authority higher than the party, others can easily be sacrificed to historical necessity or party interest, which really is just the interest of the party leaders. Whenever rulers failed to protect the oppressed, when they exploited the poor or refused to accept the equality of all before God, there were outstanding personalities that tend to remind them that God's love for every single man is the true measure of a just society. The very first Christian emperors experienced this. Saint Ambrose of Milan confronted the Roman Emperor Theodosius I after the massacre of Thessaloniki in 390 AD, and he made him repent in public. While the Bishop of Milan may have been the first to openly criticize a powerful ruler, he was by no means the last. In Germany, we will never forget Cardinal von Galen, who openly stated that the Nazis were breaking their own law on murder by ordering the killing for unproductive people, and that Catholics had a duty of conscience to oppose such crimes. Von Galen knew that we owe the survival of the Christian values, who to this day form the basis of our Western civilization, to those who were willing to give their lives for them in the arenas of the Roman Empire. He was ready to give his life too, like Hans and Sophie Scholl, like Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Klaus Schenk von Stauffenberg. He did not fear death. Why am I telling you this today, as we focus on human rights and China's Falun Gong practitioners? First, because China's present leader Xi Jinping, according to political scientist David Chambeau, can very well be described as a modern emperor. He has centralized power in his hands, and he is a fervent Leninist. His totalitarianism seeks complete control over the Chinese people and every aspect of their lives. The party's ideology is a synthesis of Marxism, Leninism and nationalism, and thus it is in direct conflict not only with Christianity. If we look at Falun Gong, we also find an emphasis on moral transformation and living according to higher principles. Falun Gong teaches that the universe is ordered by three basic virtues: truthfulness, compassion and forbearance. Practitioners are called to purify their hearts and conduct, overcoming selfishness and resentment through moral discipline and spiritual practice. This teaching could not be more at odds with a ruler who forces churches to hang up his portraits and remove crucifixes. So, the modern Chinese emperor no longer seeks to persecute those who oppose him, but to eradicate their beliefs and to replace them with a belief in him and his Marxist ideology. So for the Chinese Communist Party, the greatest threat is not primarily weapons, but rival sources of loyalty and truth. The party claims to be the ultimate interpreter of reality, the sole guardian of China's future, and the highest authority to which citizens must give their allegiance. Falun Gong, like Christianity, quietly but firmly rejects that claim. They teach that there is a higher law, a higher truth, and a higher lordship to which even Xi Jinping must answer. Because of this, the CCP treats both communities as structural threats. Christianity brings to China a long tradition of human dignity, conscience, and the belief that Caesar is not God, a tradition that has inspired movements for human rights and democratic accountability in other parts of the world. Falun Gong, for its part, built a huge independent network of practitioners, calling them to obey a spiritual teaching rather than party propaganda. Both Christianity and Falun Gong say that a person is more than a tool of the state, that conscience cannot be owned by any party, and that human dignity flows from a source beyond politics. That is why their message is dangerous for a totalitarian system, and why it is so vital for the future of human rights and human freedom. History has taught us that emperors and their dictatorships come and go. The true, the good and the beautiful have always prevailed. It may not look like it now, but this is precisely why the CCP is doomed to fail.
Thank you, Mrs. Kaminsky, for sharing your insights. Our next speaker is Dr. Katrina Lantos-Sweat, president of the Lantos Foundation for Human Rights and Justice, and former chair and vice chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Let us now hear from our speaker.
Hello, I'm Dr. Katrina Lantos-Sweat, and I'm so pleased to be talking to you today as this important event is held right around the anniversary of the adoption of the Genocide Convention. This is a subject that is quite close to my family's experience because, as some of you may know, I am the daughter of the late Congressman Tom Lantos, who was the only survivor of the Holocaust ever elected to serve in the United States Congress. And he will really remain so because, of course, that generation is gradually leaving the scene. My father was one of Congress's leading voices on behalf of human rights, and I have no doubt that this was in part a consequence of what he had experienced and endured in his lifetime. As a young boy growing up in Hungary, he was a passionately patriotic Hungarian. He loved his country, its culture, its music, its history. And you probably couldn't have found a prouder young Hungarian in all of that country. But then, of course, during the nightmare, the horror that was the Holocaust, he and millions of others in their countries became hunted animals. He was taken to a slave labor camp. He escaped twice. Eventually, he was able to make his way back to Budapest, and he found his way to a so-called safe house that had been set up by the extraordinary Swedish humanitarian Raoul Wallenberg, really one of the great humanitarian heroes of the Second World War. Because my dad was sort of blonde-haired and blue-eyed in a stolen Hungarian Aerocross uniform, he was able to serve as a sort of a courier in the Hungarian underground, delivering messages and vital supplies and medicines to people hidden around the city. And miraculously, he survived. But those experiences forever changed the way he looked at the world. He knew what it meant to have all the forces of government targeted against your small community and to have the rest of the world basically ignoring this tragic criminal event taking place in front of their eyes. And he sort of vowed to himself that he would always try to be a champion and a fighter for other communities targeted for brutal persecution and mistreatment. So, as I say, he was a leading voice in Congress on behalf of human rights and justice. He established the Congressional Human Rights Caucus, which after his passing was reconstituted as the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission of the United States Congress. And one of the causes that he was focused on with great commitment and great passion was the persecution of the Falun Gong in China. My father understood and led many, many fights to try and hold China accountable for its wide-ranging and massive abuses of human rights of many communities. But it's my opinion that there is perhaps no single community that has suffered more from the crimes of the Chinese Communist Party than the Falun Gong community. So we know that they have faced imprisonment and torture. They have faced social discrimination. But without a doubt, the worst crime that has been committed, and we don't know the full scale of it, but on a very significant scale against this community, has been forced organ harvesting. This is a violation of fundamental human rights so profound and really so evil that I think it's often hard for outsiders in a way to wrap their heads around it. They might hear the term used, they might hear of an article about it, but they find it hard to believe. People sort of think, oh my gosh, that kind of evil abuse of medical practices, that ended with the Holocaust. You know, the evil Dr. Mengele of great notoriety during the Holocaust, who performed horrible experiments on Jewish prisoners in concentration camps. People can barely bring themselves to read those historic accounts, but the thought and the realization that something shockingly similar has been happening in our time to a wonderful community of incredibly decent citizens of China, people who espouse the virtues that we all seek to live by, it really does boggle the mind. And it troubles me that this has not been a greater focus of lawmakers, of journalists, of popular culture, of social influencers, because really China must be held to account for this crime. There's no other word that I can offer to describe it. Now, there is an important piece of legislation currently in the Congress introduced by Senator Cruz of Texas that I hope will gain momentum in the coming months. It's really very important. It requires sanctions and targeted targeted sanctions against those who are complicit in a variety of persecutions against the Falun Gong community, but specifically in forced organ harvesting. It would provide for annual reports by the State Department. It seeks to shine a spotlight on this abuse, as well as to hold accountable those who can be identified as having been part of this crime. You know, we need to grapple whenever it comes to China with the reality that for so many countries, they are willing to look the other way when it comes to holding China accountable for its egregious record on human rights across the board. I've been talking now about the Falun Gong, but Tibetan Buddhists, of course, the Uyghur Muslims, the house church movement in China, and others have experienced the heavy, heavy hand of repression under the thumb of the Chinese Communist Party. And it is disappointing and frankly disturbing that countries, because China is big, because it is economically powerful, because it is increasingly aggressive on the world stage, are willing, if not to turn an entirely blind eye, to downplay and understate the extent of China's crimes. And when I say China, we must understand I'm referring to the Chinese Communist Party. So I just want to wrap up my remarks today by saying that those who have been fighting the fight to shine this light on the abuses being suffered by the Falun Gong, by Tibetan Buddhists, by Uyghur Muslims, by the house church movement in China, they deserve our support. They need our support. My father was often a lonely voice in the Congress condemning China and saying we must not give it most favored nation trading status. We must not give it permanent normal trade relations while they are engaged in such horrific practices. Sometimes he was successful, other times not. But I think that if we continue without ceasing and without losing our commitment to raise our voices, to shine that spotlight I've spoken about, and to tell the truth, that eventually we will prevail. So thank you for your attention, and thank you for being part of this very important gathering.
Thank you, Dr. Lantos Sweat, for your important remarks. Our next speaker is Reggie Littlejohn, a lawyer who is the founder and president of two international NGOs, Women's Rights Without Frontiers and Anti-Globalist International. Please welcome our speaker.
Thank you to Torsten Trey and to the Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting for organizing this extremely important conference on the anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There is no greater human right violator in the world than the Chinese Communist Party. And you think that 17% of the people in the world live in China. That's 17% of the people in the world who are languishing under the boot of the Chinese Communist Party. My name is Reggie Littlejohn. I am an attorney, and in the mid-90s, I represented a refugee from China in her case for political asylum in the United States who had been forcibly sterilized, meaning that she was literally dragged out of her home, screaming and crying and pleading, and held down to a table, and they performed a tubal ligation, which is major abdominal surgery, with no anesthesia, and she was permanently disabled after that. And that was for the crime of having a second child. Meanwhile, the people there, the family planning police, the womb police, I call them, were no doubt operating under quotas, like a certain number of forced abortions, certain number of forced sterilizations, etc. That was what showed me in the 90s. I had believed, the Chinese Communist propaganda that the one-child policy was voluntary. It was through that case that I found out that it was enforced through forced abortion, forced sterilization, forced contraception, and infanticide. I left the practice of law and founded Women's Rights Without Frontiers to stand up for women's rights in China to have their children. So the one-child policy lasted from 1980 to 2015, 35 years of the greatest brutality against women. There was a case of a woman, Feng Jiangmei, that my organization broke to the West, who was forcibly aborted at 7 months. And her husband took a picture of her lying in the bed next to her forcibly aborted child. And that is what I think in a lot of ways woke the world up to the brutality of the Chinese Communist Party. Then from 2016 to 2021, we had a two-child policy. People were saying, oh, this is great. Maybe we will have less sex-selective abortion of baby girls, because that's one of the big problems that happened under the one-child policy. One of the domino effects of the one-child policy was the sex-selective abortion of baby girls, because when you get son preference, together with a low birth limit, together with ultrasound, together with the availability of abortion, all those things conspire to the sex-selective abortion of baby girls. And estimates vary, but between 30 to 40 million more men than women living in China today. When China moved from a one-child policy to a two-child policy in 2016, many people celebrated saying, oh, this is great. Now more girls will be born. And I countered that saying, no, I don't think that that's the case at all. I think that particularly second daughters are going to be at a lot of risk, because many people in China don't even want to have a second child. And a lot of the people who are willing to go to the effort and expense of raising a second child in China are people who have had a girl for their first child, and now they're willing to try for a boy on the second child. And there was a case it was in 2017, the year after the two-child policy went into effect, where there was a couple, they had had a baby girl. Under the one-child policy, they figured they were one and done. Then the two-child policy came along, and the husband said, oh, great, let's have a second child. Let's have a boy. And he forced his wife to abort 4 babies in a year because they were female, and then she died. So gendercide did not end under the two-child policy. In 2021, we came to 3-child policy. And again, people said, oh, this is great. Now people can have 3 kids. They'll let more girls live. And I said, no, because the Chinese Communist Party has browbeaten people to the extent of saying that, really one is enough, that most of the people who are willing to go to the expense of having a third child are people who already have 2 daughters. And they want a boy. And there was a statistic that came out earlier this year from the State Department, the United States Department of State, citing a statistic in China that said that nationwide in China, for every 100 girls born, there are 133 boys born, which means that approximately a third of the girls who are third children are being aborted in China. So the issue is not just the sex-selective abortion of baby girls, but the fact that the Chinese Communist Party, despite the fact that I have repeatedly called on them to say, stop all birth limits. It's not your business how many babies people have. Okay, they maintain this 3-child policy, and the question is why. And I believe that the answer is that even though they need more kids, what they want is more Han Chinese, and they're probably just keeping this 3-child policy in order to selectively use it against disfavored minorities such as Uyghurs in Xinjiang and the Tibetans. Just to say something on a bright note, we at Women's Rights Without Frontiers have a Save a Girl campaign where we have an actual network on the ground inside of China that is actively saving baby girls. We find out about women who are being pressured. Usually they have this is their second or their third daughter. They're being pressured by their family either to abort or to give the girl away, or they are so impoverished that they can't afford to keep their daughter. And we go to their door and we say, congratulations on your daughter. Girls are as good as boys, and we will give you $25 a month to help you keep your daughter. And we have saved hundreds of baby girls in the Chinese countryside that way. Similarly, we are saving abandoned widows in the Chinese countryside. There's a huge problem with senior suicide, particularly of abandoned widows in the countryside. And we are giving them $25 a month, telling them, you are a human being. created by God in his image, and you are worthy of support. This is something they've never heard from the Chinese Communist Party. So those are two projects that are a bright spot in all of this. But nevertheless, there is a similarity between forced abortion in China and continued coercive population control and the forced organ harvesting, which is this atheistic, materialistic Chinese worldview where bodies are just instruments of the state. And the Chinese Communist Party feels that they are asserting their power over every womb in the country, declaring life or death to the child that's in that womb. And similarly, they are showing a complete disregard for human rights and for human life by detaining prisoners of conscience, including and probably especially the Falun Gong, to harvest their organs for transplant. In both of these cases, they're engaging the medical establishment on behalf of ending life rather than saving life. These are some of the most egregious human rights violations on the face of the earth today. And I call upon the Chinese Communist Party to immediately stop all coercive population control and all harvesting of organs. Thank you.
Thank you, Reggie Littlejohn, for this passionate contribution to our event. Our next speaker, Carlos Iglesias Jimenez, is a human rights lawyer who has successfully prosecuted criminal cases brought by Falun Gong practitioners against former Chinese President Jiang Zemin and 4 other Chinese Communist Party leaders on charges of genocide and large-scale torture. He's also presented testimony to the United Nations Human Rights Council on the persecution of Falun Gong. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our speaker.
En estas fechas tan emblemáticas, el 9 y 10 de diciembre de cada año, se conmemora 2 declaraciones, 2 convenciones, 2 decisiones internacionales de extremada importancia a nivel mundial. El 9 de diciembre de 1948, la Asamblea General de Naciones Unidas aprueba expresamente la Convención para la Prevención y Castigo del Delito de Genocidio. Y un día después, el 10 de diciembre de 1948, se aprueba la emblemática e histórica Declaración Universal de los Derechos Humanos. Por lo tanto, estamos justo conmemorando en este momento los 77 años de vigencia de ambos textos internacionales legislativos que sin duda deberían haber hecho cambiar la concepción y la percepción que la comunidad internacional y el mundo tiene hacia la defensa de los derechos humanos y más concretamente hacia la prevención y el castigo del delito de genocidio. Sin embargo, nos encontramos que 77 años después, uno de los mayores y más cruentos genocidios de la historia de la humanidad, como es el que está ocurriendo en China, desde el 20 de julio de 1999, a día de hoy, 77 años después, continúa impune, sin haber sido prevenido, sin haber sido castigado, vulnerando por tanto los principios, la esencia de la Convención para la Prevención y Castigo del Delito de Genocidio. Es inaplicable en estos momentos en China. La realidad incuestionable, múltiples evidencias, no solamente indicios, sino pruebas fehacientes, acreditan que el Partido Comunista Chino está torturando, asesinando e intentando destruir un grupo religioso, un grupo espiritual, un grupo numerosísimo de más de posiblemente 100 millones de chinos, ciudadanos chinos libres, practicantes de la antigua enseñanza espiritual china llamada Falun Gong. Estos crímenes terribles que deberían conmover a la comunidad internacional están pasando inadvertidos, en silencio. No puede seguir tolerándose esto. Desde la conciencia, desde la aplicación de la legalidad vigente, desde la propia comunidad internacional, no puede tolerarse con el silencio los crímenes del Partido Comunista Chino. No se puede permitir que haya detenciones ilegales sin juicios. No se puede permitir que las mujeres sean encarceladas en celdas de hombres donde son múltiplemente violadas. No se puede permitir que se utilicen bastones eléctricos dando descargas eléctricas a las partes sensibles del organismo. No se puede permitir el horrible y terrible crimen de la sustracción forzada de órganos. Millones de ciudadanos chinos, por sus libres creencias espirituales, están siendo utilizados como banco de órganos vivos, extirpándoles su hígado, sus riñones, el corazón, hasta la córnea de los ojos. Para poder realizar estos trasplantes a los propios chinos, muchos de ellos dirigentes del Partido Comunista Chino, u otros ciudadanos extranjeros que viajan a China previo pago de cifras cuantiosas, 100.000, 150.000, 200.000 dólares, generando una maquinaria multimillonaria para el Partido Comunista Chino, para que se enriquezca de una manera corrupta y sangrienta el Partido Comunista Chino. Hoy hago un llamamiento a la comunidad internacional. Hoy hago un llamamiento a quienes pueden legislar y también muy especialmente a la comunidad legal. No se puede seguir tolerando el genocidio en China del Partido Comunista Chino contra los practicantes de Falun Gong. Y hay que simplemente tomar conciencia y acción, poniendo un freno al Partido Comunista Chino. Los negocios no pueden estar nunca por delante de la vida, la dignidad, la integridad física de las personas, la libertad de conciencia, la libertad de religión. No se puede estrechar las manos sangrientas de genocidas o torturadores para hacer negocios. Solo puede basarse la tolerancia hacia el Partido Comunista Chino por la comunidad internacional por tres razones. Por miedo, por conveniencia política, económica o por sobornos. Cualquiera de las tres causas que se estén llevando a cabo ante este silencio cómplice, es evidente que cuando se destape a un nivel de conocimiento general, se hará justicia. Justicia aquí, en este mundo, y también justicia para aquellos que tienen creencias, justicia divina. Y les pido simplemente, tomen acción, miren dentro de ustedes mismos, tomen acción, por favor. La vida de millones de chinos está en juego. La pregunta es, ¿qué va a hacer usted? Tenga el valor, tenga la dignidad, tenga el coraje de dar un paso adelante y decirle al Partido Comunista Chino: no admito ni un momento más estar de tu lado con estos crímenes. Te doy la espalda. No admito más este genocidio. Muchas gracias. Y tomen acción, por favor.
Thank you, Carlos Iglesias Jimenez, for your powerful remarks. Our final speaker for this session is Jan Ikelek, senior editor with the Epoch Times and the host of the show American Thought Leaders. Ladies and gentlemen, let's hear from our speaker.
I'm Jan Jekielek, senior editor at the Epoch Times and host of our show American Thought Leaders. So I've been in the space of this forced organ harvesting issue for basically 2 decades. It was back in 2006 that I actually did some of the first reporting on it. But let me backtrack a little bit. It's actually incredible to be part of this group, to participate in this historic forum, because some of the people presenting are really some of the heroes of the movement, the people that did the primary research. And I was thinking to myself, what is it that I can add to this whole thing that would be the most useful? I was actually back in 2005, between 2005 and 2006, I was working as a human rights worker of sorts on this, what became an underground railroad that was bringing prisoners of conscience, Falun Gong practitioners out of China through the Golden Triangle into Bangkok, and then through the UN system by kind of an interesting quirk in how the system worked. They had never signed the Genocide Convention. They could get UN refugee status and then get resettled to the refugee accepting countries. And we were helping, making sure that none of them ever got repatriated to China, basically. And in the process, I got to know a lot of Falun Gong practitioners. A little bit later that year, just to flesh this out a little bit for you as well, I was traveling to Poland. The International Society for Human Rights had actually invited me. I'm a native speaker in Polish to potentially work there. And as I was there speaking with them, I basically encountered the first, I think, credible reports of the organ harvesting. And the two things were happening. Jacob Levy, the former head of the Israeli Transplant Association, who I'm sure many people are familiar with, he had found that he had a patient that had basically gone to China and gotten a heart in 2 weeks, which was unbelievable. And 10,000 people in Israel around that time had signed a petition to kind of expose the realities around that what is it that could allow for an organ transplant of a heart in 2 weeks so quickly. To expose this reality that there's some kind of forced organ harvesting system happening in China, to expose that at Auschwitz. And I actually went and helped organize that event for them at the time. I actually did a little bit of reporting on it as well. So on the one hand, I was working with the Falun Gong, basically firsthand. And the second part, I was actually, basically involved in, I guess, exposing this issue to a broader public. As we finally realized that this was actually real. I found it hard to believe, as many people did. Now, what can I add to the discussion? A lot of people are kind of shocked at the idea that a group like Falun Gong, peaceful meditation practice or Qigong practice, would be persecuted by anybody, right? And a little bit of context. So for those that aren't familiar, this was a practice based on truthfulness, compassion, and forbearance, 3 core principles, and slow exercises that look a little bit like Tai Chi, and also a sitting meditation, like what you would think of when you think of sitting meditation and lotus position. And this is something that I learned over decades, basically working with Falun Gong practitioners. It's a very interesting system because it doesn't sort of fit into a lot of conventional organizations, let's say, that we're familiar with. So there's a man named Li Hongzhi who's the teacher or the master. Some people don't like that term, and he's written voluminous teachings on how to live truthfulness, compassion, and forbearance or tolerance. And there's voluminous teachings, but there aren't actually a lot of rules. And rules might be something that every Falun Gong practitioner agrees on. So let me share what I found those to be. One of them is that you can't enrich yourself from the practice. So the Falun Gong doesn't have a treasury or something of this nature. Okay. Another thing is that there's no hierarchy in the system. There's no worship of the master or the teacher, that you're supposed to follow the teachings. And of course, people may have a lot of respect for the teacher or the master, but the worship is a different sort of thing altogether. Another thing which I really found fascinating was that if someone is a very good Falun Gong practitioner that another practitioner might be looking at and wanting to emulate, wanting to follow, wanting to basically copy, if you will, a practitioner isn't allowed to do that. In fact, the understanding the teachings and living them is what's required. At least this is what I've come to understand. And so it's kind of it's unusual. There's other things. There's no roster. What makes you a Falun Gong practitioner is living the teachings. There's no kind of belonging. There's no membership you can join or something like that. It's also nonviolent. And you add all these things up, and it just struck me one day. This was maybe 15 years into working on this. If you were to design, try to design a system that could stand up to a totalitarian structure, a totalitarian regime. And remember, communism, and some people aren't aware of this, is really what I kind of describe it as obscenely hierarchical. If you were to design a system that could kind of resist that, it would look something, I think, like Falun Gong, because there's an unusual level of personal agency in the practice of everybody. Like, everyone in there is there because they want to be. There's no kind of external pressures, or not many, that would kind of keep you in there in the first place. So this grew like wildfire, this practice. So many people started doing it in China in the 90s. And by, I think it was 1999 or 1998, there was a government census, 70 to 100 million people were found to be practicing this. I mean, all across China. I understand there were 10,000 outdoor practice sites in Beijing alone. You can imagine people everywhere. 1 in 13 Chinese approximately were doing this. And at that time, the Communist Party, Jiang Zemin was the dictator, decided that this would become the newest. In communist society, there's always a group that's sort of the internal enemy. And that group became the Falun Gong practitioners. It was the students in 1989. It became the Falun Gong practitioners in 99. And at that time, so so why? Well, bigger than the Communist Party of China. But I think it actually is deeper. I think it's because the communism, and this is again something that I've been learning over the last couple of decades, demands either total obedience or performative obedience to the system, okay? And Falun Gong practitioners are kind of very different. We're kind of basically building up entirely outside of that. And these communist systems, they really don't like that. They like everything to fit neatly into that communist hierarchy and ideology and atheist ideology. So I think that's actually the biggest reason that this persecution began. And I also think that they didn't fully understand what they were getting into. They imagined that they would get rid of the leaders and suddenly it would collapse or something like that. But that's not what happened. There really weren't leaders. Basically people were doing this largely of their own volition. The people that weren't, stopped. But a whole lot of people were kept doing it, and literally millions of people were put into the system. And those millions of people being put in the system is what facilitated the conditions for this horrible forced organ harvesting crime against humanity to happen. There was also this, as is always the case when a new group of people is persecuted. I mean, think about 1930s Germany and the language that was used then to basically demonize the Jewish people. That same language was used, very similar language was used in 1999 onwards in communist China by the regime, by their propaganda organs, to demonize the Falun Gong. Remember, these people were kind of, you might even think a lot of them were model citizens. They're living truthfulness, compassion, forbearance. They're putting others first. They're doing all of this stuff. And now all of a sudden you're supposed to believe they're evil. Well, massive propaganda went into the system. And these are the conditions where forced organ harvesting can happen, because now people are being blood typed, tissue typed, basically their vitals are being taken, and that's what allows someone from outside to look up an ad in the newspaper where it says, I can get you a new heart in 2 weeks if you pay the right amount of money, and you can go in 2 weeks and get a new heart because the so-called donor, the victim, is being basically matched into an existing database and shipped and killed to order. I'm actually putting together a book on this topic. It's titled Kill to Order. And it, basically bringing out a lot of the work that the amazing people that are part of this forum have been doing for so many years. The other thing that I think I can bring to to this, I understand, as a comprehensive review, is how perception has changed over time, because that's been my area. I very soon after 05 and 06, I went into journalism full time. And at the beginning, it was very hard to talk about this issue, extremely difficult. Basically people just didn't want to know. And there's lots of examples. There's a famous example of Jan Karski, the Polish nobleman traveling during World War II, trying to explain the Holocaust to people. People didn't want to believe him. Okay, people don't want to believe these extreme types of things can happen. Like I was just describing. Really, you're killing people to order at scale. And frankly, I've been focusing on this issue on and off over the years. And during some of those years, it was actually very difficult. It was very I guess you didn't see a lot of hope, and most major media didn't want to touch it, and at that time, Epoch Times was a lot smaller, and so we wondered, is this issue ever really going to see the light of day? But again, a number of people that are at this forum just kept kind of trucking along and getting the work done. And today we're in a very unusual place, I think, and I think there's a lot of cause for hope. So this is what I want to share. There's 7 states now, and I just checked in this year a number of states passed legislation on this issue. There's 7 states that have passed legislation that's kind of modeled in part on what Jacob Levy back in the day, when he discovered that patient who had gotten that 2-week heart transplant. He campaigned in Israel, which had a socialized healthcare, to make sure that system didn't pay for China transplants. There were other aspects of that law. Now it took more than a decade, right? It took another it took another 20 years, basically, almost, for this legislation to type of legislation percolate into the United States. So over the last 3 years or so, now 7 states have legislation of that nature, where Medicare and insurance isn't allowed to pay for those kinds of transplants. That's good. And that's growing. And there's a number of other states that are kind of bringing it up and starting to pass this. At the federal level, there's actually 2 pieces of legislation that have passed the House near unanimously. One is called the Stop Forced Organ Harvesting Act. That was Chris Smith's bill. And another one is the Falun Gong Protection Act. That was Scott Perry's bill. Now they're both in the Senate, and they're, being considered. They haven't been, brought to the floor to vote, and that's, indeed perhaps a project that others may discuss during this forum. But they're there, and there's a year and a month to get them passed, which is a significant amount of time. And there's actually a third bill that hasn't made it out of committee quite yet by Congressman Neil Dunn. I just had him on American Thought Leaders about it. It's called the Block Act, and that's modeled in the similar way to these state-level legislations that I described earlier. So that's huge. And to actually build this out a little more, back in September, the Baltimore Sun, I noticed, actually one of the owners of Baltimore Sun wrote a very influential op-ed on basically how America is complicit in the Chinese transplant, in facilitating the transplant system. It was quite a remarkable piece. And Health and Human Services, HHS, actually jumped in and responded to this. So to give a little background, in America, there's been 2 transplant systems, that have been decertified for violating the dead donor rule. Okay, for violating the dead donor rule. And that basically means that basically the method of extraction, the method of killing of the way the person dies is the organ extraction itself. And this is something which, in my opinion, in China is routine. It's the way it's done normally. There's this seminal paper by Matthew Robertson and Jacob Levy, that execution by organ procurement, which documents that it's even written. It's so common that it's written into the transplant literature in China. They don't even realize that it's a problem. Well, that kind of thing is starting to happen in the U.S., right? And so after Armstrong Williams published that op-ed, I actually wrote back. I wrote a letter to the editor and later published another op-ed in that vein. And amidst all of this, HHS actually responded, and I'm going to read what they said, right? They said, HHS exposed systemic violations of the dead donor rule for organ harvesting in U.S. hospitals where organs are harvested from patients who may not have been fully deceased. That's the American part. Then they say, in China, forced organ harvesting of prisoners has continued for over 20 years. To affirm the sanctity of human life, America must sever its ties with China's organ transplant system. And, you know, the essence of this new op-ed was also about, you know, how one might do that, what are approaches to do that. So it's not just the legislative branch in the U.S. at the state level and at the federal level that's interested in this, but it's like the Health and Human Services, the major agency dealing with this issue, is interested in America. So I don't know. I think there's a lot of cause for hope, and I'm thrilled to be able to be a part of this whole activity. I can't wait to see what else happens here.
Thank you, Jan Jekielek, for your comprehensive and hopeful remarks. So I'd like to thank our honored speakers for their powerful presentations and elaborations in our third session commemorating the anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Please join us in our final session that will start in about 1 hour at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time to listen to our guests discuss these human rights and medical atrocities. We hope to provide comprehensive solutions for preventing continued abuse and to work together to stop forced organ harvesting. Given the atrocity that humankind is now facing, there is much more to do to end this crime against humanity. Forced organ harvesting from living prisoners of conscience can by no means or excuse be accepted in today's global community, and every doctor and every individual has to make a decision. Do I want to live in a world where a government can arbitrarily kill innocent people for their organs, or do I speak up now? If you agree that it's time to act, please join us to break the silence and to end this violation to our humanity. Thank you all for joining us in this third session, and we'll see you in our final one. Goodbye for now. Today webinar on forced organ harvesting and the cold genocide of Falun Gong practitioners. On the anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we reflect on the systematic and heinous methods that the Chinese Communist Party is using to persecute Falun Gong practitioners. We will discuss how the communist government in China has used brainwashing, forced labor, torture, and even forced organ harvesting to take away the freedom of belief and expression of Falun Gong practitioners. Before we begin, please allow me to welcome our audience that is watching us on live stream via Epoch TV, NTD TV, and Gunjing World. Thank you for joining us today. Some of you joined us in our morning session where we listened to speeches from a range of experts. These experts will now come together to discuss topics which are of urgency in today's global community. So let's welcome our speakers. I have a question that is addressed to the whole panel as we begin here. So my question is, why are human rights so critical for the international community? What benefits do they bring to humankind? And why is it important to defend human rights? Who would like to start? Yes, Mrs. Kaminsky.
Well, I'm Dr. Katrina Lantos-Sweat, and I'm delighted to take a first crack at that rather sweeping question. As perhaps some in your audience will know, but many won't, I'm the daughter of 2 Holocaust survivors. And I think as we look back on that extraordinarily tragic and horrific episode in human history, we understand that it was the world's revulsion at the realization of the horrors of the Holocaust, the horrors of what can happen and the magnitude of it when we do not ground our fundamental values in the inherent dignity and worth of every human being. And so really it was in the aftermath of the tragedy of the Holocaust that the world came together to adopt the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to recognize that if we wanted to build a better world, we better start with architecture that enshrined fundamental protections for each and every human being. And so I think the preservation and the fight to advance human rights is really central to building a better world, building the kind of world any one of us would want to live in.
Appreciate that. Thank you very much. I'd like to now call on Mrs. Kaminsky.
Yes, thank you. Well, I believe that human rights are very important because they simply serve to safeguard the vulnerable, to protect them against powers, and in order to limit powers and those who are in the ruling class, we need something that we can all agree on, and the human rights are exactly that framework that everybody can relate to, that everybody can say, well, this is important for all of humanity. And if we all agree on that, and it is an international or an interstate agreement, then we can hold all powers accountable to that. And that's why I believe that human rights are so important today.
Thank you very much. I'd like to call on Reggie Littlejohn as well. Oh, you're muted.
My answer to that question is a bit personal, because I personally believe that every human being is created by God in his image, and that when human rights are violated anywhere in the world, it's like spitting in the face of God, the God who created that person in his image. And then also there's just the sense of compassion. I remember, as you know, my expertise is not in necessarily forced organ harvesting, but more in forced abortion in China. When I was an attorney in the 90s, I had a couple of miscarriages, which was really traumatic. Then I represented a refugee in China who actually, she had been forcibly sterilized, but that's how I found out about forced abortion in China. And as I was sitting at my desk in my law office thinking about how I was living the American dream, I knew that women were being dragged out of their homes, held down to tables, forcibly aborted up to the 9th month of pregnancy. And some of these forced abortions were so violent that the women themselves lost their lives along with their full-term babies. And having just suffered 2 miscarriages myself, I couldn't stand it. I could not stand that this is happening to women on the other side of the world. So I just think that it's has to do with just basic compassion for other people. All of us are created by God in his image.
Appreciate you sharing. Thank you. Jan, I'd like to call on you as well, seeing as you've got years of being part of the Falun Gong community and commenting on them. Please share.
Well, the thing I wanted to mention actually is there's been this very disturbing rise in what's called utilitarian bioethics in not just communist societies, which are basically based on that, as far as I can tell, but with the Communist Party deciding what the greatest good for the entire population is. It also in Western societies, and this inherent, the thing that Dr. Lantos Sweat mentioned, which is the inherent dignity of the individual, basically enshrining that is so critical and reinforcing that, because what can happen in this greatest good for the greatest number model is that we end up basically deciding that we're going to, in this kind of emergency triage situation like you might have on a battlefield or something like that, we're deciding we're going to sacrifice some individuals so-called for the greater good, but that never works out well. So the concept of human rights, I think, is incredibly important today specifically, and this forced organ harvesting is kind of a great example, because if you look at, take this hot mic moment that we saw with Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un the other day, right, where they're talking about continual organ transplantations to achieve immortality, this sort of thing, right? Well, in this situation, you can imagine, well, the greatest good is that the party elites live as long as possible. Of course, that's obviously the greater good in that society. Well, in a totalitarian, a technocratic state, you can basically, anybody, even the highest level, party official, in a way, someone who has the best social credit score, could immediately, in a split second, become the bottom of the barrel and be organ harvested if their, unique blood type happens to match the need of a elite official or something like that. Human rights are, I think, a central issue, a central concept around which we should be, constructing our, ethical structure today, in my opinion, not just internationally, but in our own societies.
Thank you. Is there anyone else that would like to comment on that? Yes, Sir Nice.
the people who drafted the Universal Declaration were viscerally connected to what had happened, which may explain why they came from such wide backgrounds, not just people of religion, atheists like me, a Confucian philosopher who was of great assistance to Mrs. Roosevelt. That visceral understanding of whatever they felt is no longer with us. But we have their text. And their text, in my view, reflects how religion or no religion at all, we can, for various reasons, argue that humanity is single. Humanity is probably en route to destroying itself by various means, but until it does, these rights give the single humanity a chance of saving itself, for a time at least, from that eventual disappearance.
Thank you. And yes, Carlos Iglesias Jimenez. There'll be a moment while translation occurs.
There has been many years since the Human Declaration on Human Rights. And obviously, society has relaxed. And the values have been degraded. And that essence of the 77 years ago declaration has lost value in the heart of international community. My legal vision of this is that we have to prioritize the protection, integral protection to people, because it cannot be allowed that economic interest or commercial can go before the dignity, the life and the liberty of persons. And this is actually happening with the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. We will have opportunity to talk more about this. But really, it is very sad to see how international community, Western countries, keep a silence, a complicit silence on the genocide that has been happening in China for decades. And all in exchange for commercial agreements, and to actually hold the hands of people who've been who are stained by blood, by crimes that have been committed against innocent people only for their beliefs. Really, human rights at this moment is not that much about what is written, but their application and how the hearts can be moved, and how international community hearts can be moved so that they can be actually implemented. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Judge Kim, please.
It's a quite actually difficult question to answer, because it, first in my mind, at all the debates about the concept of human rights in the human rights lawyers come across. So, but whatever the definition of human right is, it's about, in my opinion, at last, is about human dignity and kind of morality, and a concept to which some of the legal professionals agree. But I think without human rights in the international society, I mean, any discussion about human rights, then it will be ruled by power, and this is going to be whole chaotic if we don't really focus on the human rights. So it's at last it's kind of, I think it's to preserve the human morality in the international society, and this is not only for the victims, but for all of the humankind, to keep this world peacefully. Thank you.
Thank you. You brought some great points up, Judge Kim, and I'd like to have a follow-up question for you. What are the consequences if we do trade our souls and moral values for economic profits in the China trades? Could the recent rise in conflicts that we see around the world be the result of 2 decades of sacrificing our principles for such economic gains? To reaffirm the human dignity and value of human life by decoupling from China, do you think we could reverse the decay in our society, just as you mentioned? That question is for Judge Kim.
Yes. The decoupling is, in reality, it's not going to be really easy, but, in principle, from the perspective of legal order, I think, the state practices, the state's practice itself forms the customary international law. And when we keep, silent for a long time, facing this kind of atrocity, then it might be breach of international law, but in the long term, it might change the law itself, degrading the core, the concept of human rights. Then I think it's a really tragedy for the international, whole society, because we are eroding the law itself, which is a very which is a foundation of our international order. So even though it's really challenging to kind of speak up against the gross human rights violations of the PRC regime, we have to, all the states and the people have to, try to do something, whatever it is, even though it is really challenging in reality, because in China it has a lot of influence on every country through trade and economic and security issues. So, but however, this is reality. Power-based reality. But at the same time, as a humankind, we should uphold our law, I think.
Thank you for that. I'd like to call on Reggie, please. Yes.
Concerning decoupling, obviously, the United States is deeply coupled to China financially and in many other ways. We need to understand that that China is waging a people's war against the United States. They're not a competitor; they're an enemy. And when we, don't decouple from them, basically, whatever the Chinese Communist Party does, their blood is on our hands because we are supporting it through our investments. So in China, there's something called the civil-military fusion. And what that means is basically that everything in civil society in China can be used or accessed by the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, by their military, including all the technology, et cetera. And I think that people in the United States, companies in the United States, when they have gone to China to manufacture things, have found that their technology has been stolen, et cetera, and that all of that is accessible to the Chinese Communist Party. So I believe that we need to systematically figure out a way to decouple from them so that we are not complicit in their atrocities.
Thank you for your comments. Would anyone else like to jump in and add? Yes, please, Mrs. Kaminsky.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I was thinking when you said that we needed to take a look at how human rights work these days. I was thinking that there is a certain human right that has become very, very important, very valuable to everyone, and that we risk turning the human rights upside down if we put too much focus on that. And maybe that has to do a little bit with when we talk about China and forced organ harvesting and so forth. And I'm talking about autonomy, which means I decide, I choose, I control. And that's not the same as dignity, which means every human being has the same worth. So what we see, I think, especially here in Europe, is that for the sake of autonomy, human dignity of others is sacrificed because that has become the absolute value that everyone focuses on. So in that model, dependence, weakness, vulnerability are seen as failures. They are seen as failures of autonomy rather than as inherent aspects of the human condition, of human beings, of human life, which call for protection every now and then and call for our solidarity. But autonomy is oddly at odds with that solidarity because you can't be solidary with somebody who is in need when you are autonomous and always look at your own worth, at your own value, and at what you want, what you think is best for you. So when we value that autonomy so much, then human dignity only applies to those who are fully autonomous. And people who are not so autonomous, say unborn children or the very old, or those with severe disabilities or serious illnesses, they can be treated as negotiable because they can make use of that autonomy. And human rights then drift away from their original purpose to protect each person simply because they are human, not because they are powerful or not because they are independent or useful, but just because they are human persons. And I think that is the problem of the West. We're putting so much emphasis on this one particular aspect of human rights, which is autonomy. And we don't see that with a focus on that particular aspect, we lose the sense for that what human rights are really all about. And that's what makes us weak in the eyes of the Chinese too, I believe.
Very interesting point. Yes, please, Jan.
If I just may, I think that was such a profound point that I had not considered before, because this is exactly the logic that allows for forced organ harvesting, doesn't it? Right? Basically, I'm saying, I have my own worth is so much more important than someone, that's been dehumanized in a large population, which is essentially what you need for forced organ harvesting to take place on the other side to be able to make those matches. I just wanted to emphasize how profound a point this was. Thank you.
Would anyone else like to comment? Yes, please, Dr. Weldon.
Yeah, as a practicing physician, a lot of what was just said really resonates with me. I think there is this balance between autonomy. I spend a lot of my professional life trying to discuss with patients the pros and cons of a treatment for typically a liver cancer, but something that's life-threatening. And we do value autonomy, and I think on the opposite end of autonomy is this idea of altruism or giving to others or thinking of the greater good. However, with in the context of forced organ harvesting, autonomy is completely lost. These are people that have been, as Jan Jekielek just said, so dehumanized, so demonized. In fact, within their own population through continuous propaganda that did little more than just want to become better human beings and to really return to a lot of the values that the Chinese civilization gave them over 5,000 years. And then they became a big threat to the Chinese Communist Party. And I think what the Chinese Communist Party has done is glommed onto the values that really helped the Chinese civilization thrive, like giving for the greater good, but used it as a weapon, just as they have used forced organ harvesting as a weapon against their own people. Just to go back, this is the first time I've talked on the webinar so far, but just to go back, I think part of human rights is standing up to tyranny. And with the Chinese Communist Party, you have tyranny like I've never seen before. If you sat me down and said, imagine what the worst thing that one of the most trustworthy professions, being physicians or surgeons, what's one of the worst things that they could do or be used by a tyrannical system, I couldn't have come up with forced organ harvesting. It just wouldn't have crossed my mind. And the fact that this has become a tool for certainly profit, but in my opinion, in my view, for a destruction of not just a population and a people, but a destruction of the core values of truth, compassion, and tolerance. And not just truth, compassion, and tolerance, but the values that helped the Chinese civilization thrive dynasty after dynasty until I think the last dynasty fell in 1912 or 1913. And since the Chinese Communist Party took power a year after 1948, back in 1949, I do feel that the Chinese Communist Party has basically hijacked every good thing about the Chinese civilization and essentially ruined it, and that includes the profession of medicine.
Yes, please, Katrina.
Yeah, what an interesting discussion. And to sort of bring it to the topic that I think brings us all here today, namely forced organ harvesting. I want to agree with what Dr. Weldon said, that it is so macabre, so evil, so profoundly, really revolting to any caring human being that it sort of stops us cold. But there can be no greater violation of both human dignity and human autonomy than those that involve the literal physical destruction of a human being in order for commercial reasons to harvest their organs. It's really sort of shocking beyond belief. I loved what Carmela brought up about sort of the tension, if you will, sometimes between autonomy and a desire to uplift the dignity of all people. But I think one thing that we get right in the West, generally speaking, and that I certainly subscribe to, and that would be the idea that compelled altruism, compelled virtue, compelled sacrifice on behalf of the greater good, is sort of suspect in and of itself. That's why I think it's really impossible to conceive of the whole human rights project apart from a robust defense of human freedom. Freedom and human rights and human dignity are, to me, inextricably linked with one another. They're not the same, but they are powerfully woven together. And maybe a three-legged stool, you can't really meaningfully have one without the others. But yeah, we really are facing, in the case of this international crime of forced organ harvesting, something that is so disturbing that I think a lot of people find it hard to believe it's happening. With the intentionality and on the scale that the evidence which Sir Nice and others have documented, that it is occurring in China.
Thank you for that. During yesterday's panelists' presentations, one thing that really moved me to tears was the horrible discovery of pediatric organ extraction. This was news to me, with one figure at 3,000 known pediatric liver transplants, forced artificial insemination on female practitioners to bear children for organs is now underway, and a baby farm, if you will. I'd like to call on Reggie, please, if you could maybe touch on this or share your comments. Were you aware of this, or have you heard of this? You're muted.
All right. So I was reading about this yesterday. And so I did an internet search, and they said that there's no hard evidence. Maybe you presented the hard evidence yesterday, but it wouldn't surprise me that the Chinese Communist Party would do something like that, or that, because of the way that they just view bodies as instruments of the state. I mean, they have no belief, they are officially atheistic, which is, there are great atheists who would be, opposed, who are opposed to this stuff. But what I'm saying is, they just think that it's okay for either to declare a woman, whether she can have her child or not, has to do with whether or not she has a birth permit, or to forcibly extract somebody's organs while they're still alive, to creating baby farms to extract organs from babies. It seems to me to be within their character to do such a thing. And then and the whole idea then of forced pregnancy, okay, forcing women to become pregnant, to carry these babies. And I don't know what they tell the women that they're doing with their children. They're certainly taking the babies away from their mothers. Probably they might tell them, oh, we're going to put this baby up for adoption or whatever. But these women, I'm sure, are not stupid, and they probably have some idea about what's happening, that the baby's not going up for adoption. So, I mean, I would like to see a really robust campaign to expose this. And of course, Women's Rights Without Frontiers would be more than happy to take some kind of a role in that, to prove to the international community that it really is happening. Because again, it's a level of horror that I didn't even want to believe, and to say this is happening and it must be stopped, and to get people to understand the Chinese Communist Party is evil, and we should not be collaborating with them. I think that perhaps they could be characterized as a transnational criminal organization, especially if they're trafficking organs, either of adults or of babies, across national lines, across borders.
Thank you. We have a few hands up. I saw Dr. Weldon. Did you still want to jump in?
Yeah, I just want to make a couple points. I mean, one is that evil knows no bounds. I mean, once something this evil has happened, it knows no bounds. In some ways, if you look back to 2006, when David Matas and David Kilgore published their first report, which was published in book form as The Bloody Harvest in 2009, if the medical community had stood up and said, this is preposterous, I can't believe this is happening, and actually looked at the data, looked at the evidentiary trails, and stopped it, you wouldn't have had the Uyghurs as the next victim group. And I've heard these allegations as well. And to me, once evil is allowed to go rampant and really has nothing pushing back on it, the evil really does know no bounds.
Thank you. Yes, Mrs. Kaminsky.
Thank you. Well, I think I can see a pattern here. So at the beginning of all of these things, whether it is organ donation or organ harvesting or surrogacy and forced organ extraction from children, or even farming children in order to be able to have their organs later on, there was always a very good impulse at the beginning. And it all has to do with Christian values, really. It all has to do with sympathy, with compassion, with looking after, caring for your next. So those are Christian virtues, and it's these things that that are appealed when people say, look, here somebody is very sick and they need an organ. Here is a couple that is desperate because they want a child. How can you not help them? So in all these practices, we start with a very good impulse like sympathy or charity or compassion, but then it is twisted and it's weaponized. At the beginning, it's weaponized, like in surrogacy. These feelings are weaponized and used for the commercial benefit of surrogacy agencies. And then it's taken another step further and it's combined with organ harvesting. And in organ donation, it was the same thing. How can you not help somebody? How can you not want to become a donor? So there's a good impulse at the beginning, but then again, that is twisted and turned upside down. And I think that's what is so diabolical at it. At the beginning, or about all these things, that you start with something really good, with a Christian virtue, and then it's twisted and weaponized and instrumentalized against Christianity itself, against humanity itself, and turned more or less upside down. I think that's a terrible, terrible thing to witness, but it is exactly the reason why we Christians have to stand up and say, let's put an end to this. You don't use our Christian virtues to justify something which is profoundly bad at its core.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Carlos. We'll wait one moment for translation.
It has been 26 years since the persecution to Falun Gong started. And CCP evilness has no limits. In my opinion, after many years of legal research, forced organ harvesting is the final solution. The genocide against Falun Gong practitioners. All international community must understand that when you don't torture people with electrical batons in sensible parts of the body, when you strip naked women and lock them up in men's prisons, when you are committing the biggest atrocities, it gets to the point that finally you can make a huge profit, corrupt profit with Falun Gong practitioners. Then is when the forced organ harvesting emerges as a final solution. Which is the culmination of the genocide against Falun Gong. To think about farm babies, or babies' farms, is absolutely compatible with the evilness of the CCP. The question is not why this is happening. The question is, what is the international community going to do to stop this? And this is from heart to heart. No, it's not about reason. It has to be something coming from the heart. We have to stop this.
Yes, yeah.
You know, something that I've realized over the last several decades of reporting is that if you look at the incentive structures that are created around an issue, right, you can kind of understand, come to some understanding about how plausible it is that it's happening. I read these reports. It was actually very difficult to do, quite frankly. You sort of I keep explaining to people how it's very difficult to talk about the forced organ harvesting issue at all because people just instinctively don't want to know, don't want to believe that's something that human beings are capable of something. So when I encountered this pediatric organ transplant issue, I experienced that for the first time. I've been quite desensitized to these things for a while, but just somehow, because it's, using the most vulnerable, with the least agency, basically children or just born children and so forth. It's just unfathomable. I didn't want to read. In fact, it took me several days to actually read the whole original reports around this. And the problem is, again, when you get to this situation where you have a totally dehumanized population of people, and you have to remember too that while the CCP has been very good at kind of fostering a kind of weird Han supremacy, which a lot of people don't want to talk about, but the minorities are dehumanized, right? When they actually attacked the Falun Gong, they actually dehumanized, a whole large swath of Han people themselves, right? So it almost created this situation where anything goes, right? Anybody can be now used as fodder for organs. Including and as these things escalate, right, including, it seems, children. And when they're in a situation, as people describe, I think Reggie described it as just pure evil, or just, let's call it, a complete lack of ethical guardrails or boundaries, i.e. there's no limit to what can be done in the service of science or longevity, as we've been learning, right, with their 981 longevity project. Anything goes. It becomes very clear that if you have a group of people that are dehumanized at this level, and you've built a society where almost anybody can now be used in this sort of macabre, kind of mechanistic way to provide organs or for experimentation or whatever purpose. It's really hard to imagine how it wouldn't be happening, right? And so I think what we should be doing now is encouraging deep research into this area, because I think, again, it's an opportunity to help expose the depths of the depravity of this regime. And I'm not someone who's for completely severing all ties, because then that evil just kind of continues in the darkness, so to speak, right? But you have to know who you're dealing with. And this is the biggest problem that we have. This is how the Chinese Communist Party took basically advantage of the West and the United States and the West and so forth, is that they somehow convinced us, we could have a whole discussion about how that they were kind of a liberalizing force. Like, if we put enough money into the system, into their system, they would liberalize, like a South Korea or a Taiwan or something like that. But they were totalitarian at their core, and they knew that, and it was a game, and it was a play, and they had no intention of changing or fostering any form of civil society at all. And so here we are. And, you can only imagine, I couldn't even imagine this pediatric, transplantation farming sort of situation. But the moment I heard it, I knew it must be true. Why? Because the incentive structures all point towards it happening. There's a huge upside if you have zero ethical boundaries, and there really isn't a lot of downside when you have a large dehumanized population.
Thank you. Sir Jeffrey Nice, I'd like to hear from you as well. You're muted.
The improbability or unbelievability argument is actually very easy to deal with, and I'm surprised that people don't deploy the argument swiftly. There was already a system applied to capital punishment, death row prisoners, and all that had to be done was to open another door of the prison into an existing system where all the people needed to operate the system were in place. It's rather similar to what might have happened in the gas chambers operated in Nazi Germany if yet another category of people had been subject to what was being done, mostly to Jews, but also to other people. Opening another door to an existing system is not unbelievable at all. And so, although I sympathize with those who found it very difficult to read about and to accept that these things were happening, actually, it's very obvious that they could, as well as evidence-based that they did.
Thank you. I'd actually like to follow up with you there, Sir Nice. The China Tribunal said in the short form of its final judgment that governments and any who interact with the People's Republic of China should recognize that they're interacting with a criminal state. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that for the audience who's unfamiliar with that?
The China Tribunal did a very limited thing, which I think is of considerable potential value wherever it is done. Namely, it recognized that what was being described as a dreadful violation of human beings was not being acted on by governments when they should have done. If you want to persuade someone to do something that they don't want to do, and governments don't want to deal with China, they don't want to deal with Russia, they don't want to deal with Israel, all sorts of places. If you want to improve the chance of something being done by an actor currently unwilling, you need to establish a fact that cannot be challenged. Maybe having established that fact, your best practice on course is not then to try and make the argument yourself, but to say, here is a fact for others to use who have power and may be inclined to use it. So the others can be non-governmental organizations, parliamentarians, senators, all sorts of things in different places. What you need to have is an absolutely unchallengeable fact. And so what the China Tribunal did, and it did no more, was in a process that was fully public, nothing secret, with the law presented to us at its most conservative by outsiders, not by ourselves. Those of us who had legal training acted without being lawyers. We were just like jurors. We applied the strictest test of factual finding, proof beyond reasonable doubt. We found facts, we applied the law, we came to conclusions. And those conclusions were of crimes against humanity and torture. We considered but decided we could not make a finding of genocide. I'll come back to that if anyone wants to know. And by making those findings, we were, of course, finding that the state, because this could be traced right up to the top, responsibility for it was a criminal state. And if I can just add one point, what is truly regrettable in the last 5 years, or nearly 5 years, since the 22 invasion of Ukraine, and since the response by Israel to the most dreadful possible crimes committed in October 23. What's regrettable is that countries of all kinds claiming to be respectable did not, on whatever it would be, the 23rd or the 24th of February 22, and sometime fairly early in 24, when the response of Israel was clearly disproportionate and excessive, why a country didn't say, this country is, to the limited extent now shown, a criminal state. They didn't. And of course, that's allowed things to drag on and on. Whereas if you say, yes, this is a criminal state, then you have to do something about it.
Thank you. Jan, I see your hand there. You are muted.
Thank you. Sir Jeffrey, first of all, thank you for chairing the tribunal. I'd really changed the game and our ability to be able to communicate around the issue of forced organ harvesting from Falun Gong practitioners. It was transformational from the perspective of many people being much more open to learning the reality. That's kind of what I've been tracking all this time. Here's the question I wanted to ask you, actually. This is kind of a perfect moment. You'd made this decision that you couldn't establish that there was genocide happening because it requires this, I think, the specific intent. Maybe you can kind of disambiguate this for me, but I understood the reason you decided that it wasn't genocide was because there was this profit motive, because it was actually arguably a multi-billion-dollar industry that was created, so the profit motive could account for it. Now, could you actually disambiguate that? Like, what is required for an actual genocide designation, and why you chose not to do that?
Oh, you are muted there.
We didn't choose not to do it. We decided not to do it, given the rules that we had imposed on ourselves. Those were rules of being satisfied beyond reasonable doubt and applying a conservative law, not for us, 7 as it was, members of the public, to start expanding the law. Now, with that in mind, we had two problems, or not problems, there were 2 obstacles to going further and finding genocide, which requires, on the part of the doer, the perpetrator, an intention to destroy a group in whole or part. The critical words are intent to destroy. If you've got a mixed intent to destroy maybe, but certainly an intent to make a commercial profit out of what you're doing, then it's quite hard to say that the dominant and effective intention is the one to destroy. And you'll find in the judgment that we noted that we had limited access at that time, less, for example, than we had in the Uyghur tribunal, to the decision-making processes from the top down. We also recognized that we had some curiosities in the evidence, namely Falun Gong practitioners imprisoned, tested medically, so presumably for the suitability of their organs, but when they weren't killed in order for their organs to be extracted, they were released. And this was within a setting where they could be killed quite easily if the state had wanted to. So we took the necessarily cautious line and decided only that which was clear beyond reasonable doubt. Now, of course, the judgment allows for others to build on it with other evidence. But if you've established something that is clear, simple, and factual, and I'll come to one other point as an indulgence in a minute, then you're doing a much better service, probably, to those who would want to use your factual finding than saying anything that is capable of being the subject of argument. So that if we had said genocide, and somebody had said, it's not genocide, and then you've had lawyers who love spending time writing things and talking about things, writing reams about why it wasn't genocide, not why it hadn't happened at all. And so our tribunal was very determined to be limited in what it did. We're not activists. We don't engage as activists now. Why should we? That's not what we were there for. We found facts, applied the law, reached a conclusion. And we reinforced that by making no recommendations. And actually, I didn't have a summary. The summary was prepared by someone else. I said, this is the judgment. We're not going to go off and make recommendations because that allows people to argue about the facts. Does that help?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, and I mean, it helps incredibly. There's just this, kind of I don't know if it's an irony. I don't know exactly how to describe it, but the fact that there is this profit motive is, I don't know if it makes it more macabre. It does for me in a sense, right? Because you have a combination, right? I think there is a lot of established evidence that there was this, this eradication language and so forth, that there was a specific intent to destroy the group. But then it's like the profit motive becomes a bonus. I think Matthew Robertson in his PhD thesis describes it as extractive repression, like it's kind of like a methodology of sorts. And it almost makes it worse, right? And I guess in my mind, and I'm not in any way upending your decision making. As I said, I think the judgment was powerful and factual and unbelievably valuable for those of us who are actually hoping to educate people about the reality of this.
Well, can I just say thank you for that? I think in other areas as well, limiting the function that you give to yourself or that somebody asks you to perform to that which can be clearly understood and not challenged really helps those who are activists. Can you imagine how much worse it would be if we were activists and in any way sympathetic to the Falun Gong? We used to say, not in an offensive way, we don't care about the Falun Gong in the same any more than we care about the Rohingya or victims of North Korea. We were not there to be remotely sympathetic. And we served, we hope, the rest of you a purpose by taking that hard line.
I want to give Carlos here a chance to jump in. Thank you.
This topic of the criminal state is extremely interesting. And I would like to thank Sir Geoffrey Nice for all the work he did with the China Tribunal. And I understand that his position, his function, was not to analyze if it was or not a genocide. But from my lawyer point of view, after 20 years, if there's really is a genocide that actually complies with every single of the requisites of the Convention of 1948, is Falun Gong's case. Why? Because the Chinese Politburo gave 3 instructions. 3. Defame them. Bankrupt them. And destroy them physically. In the essence of the persecution to Falun Gong, there is the eradication of all Falun Gong practitioners. That was the essence of the beginning of the persecution. And this has been proven and documented. A different thing is how this persecution evolved. At the beginning, 1999, there was not forced organ harvesting. It was just the tortures and the killings. But in the evil mind of the CCP, and with the evolution along the years of the persecution, they thought, why not corruptly earn money with the Falun Gong practitioners. And then it begins the forced organ harvesting as an additional chapter to the genocide of Falun Gong. But we have to understand that the root, the origin of the persecution of Jiang Zemin was eliminate all Falun Gong practitioners. It is truly a genocide.
Thank you very much. Judge Kim, if you want to jump in, I actually have a question for you after this as well.
I'll say, to begin with, I really express my respect for Sir Nice, because as a judge, when I read the China Tribunal judgment, it was really inspiring for me, and I really truly felt that it is a key cornerstone and stepping stone for the further step. And indeed, it was followed by the UN experts' warning, and as Sir Nice yesterday mentioned in his video, that it is really unchallenged. I mean, it's now unchallenged. At least this crime is crime against humanity. Nobody challenges this legal conclusion. And the more important thing was that the judgment confirmed the fact with the very strict standard of beyond reasonable doubt. So I really appreciate the judgment and the tribunal. As for the genocide issue, it seems that there is a continuing debate. But I respect, the decision by the tribunal, because I didn't look into all the same identical evidence which was shown in front of the tribunal, and I respect the decision based on the evidence they looked into and evaluated carefully. And meanwhile, I also noticed that the judgment said that future possibility of this crime to be redesignated as genocide. So I like to talk about the further step. And before that, personally, I think that keeping beyond reasonable doubt this strict standard was a very good point for the judgment, because it's really unchallengeable. If we keep this high standard, this is more careful and safe approach, and in this situation, so this is a very good starting point to persuade everyone to move on to the next stage and keep the credibility of the tribunal. But I think if states are not acting only because that this crime is not designated as genocide, and in reality, states have tendency when they face a crime designated genocide, they feel something they have to do under the Genocide Convention, and this is a really urgent issue, and tries to do something through UN, council or other organizations. However, when the gravity of even though the gravity of the crime is really, very grave, when the states are not acting only because it's not found as genocide, then maybe we should continue the debate. Discuss on whether this is under the definition of genocide, and develop the legal analysis and also the finding. So this is for my thought. I'm giving this thought for further analysis, and I think, in my view, it is also plausible to conclude that organ harvesting was used as a means of physically destroying the group, even though it also generated profit. So if we focus on the chronological order of the facts events, the PRC regime first commenced the systemic and deliberate demonization and persecution of Falun Gong, often torturing the group members to death. And from some point, the regime started to make use of the victim's body and gain financial profit. This factual basis was also confirmed by the tribunal judgment. And this is so. First, in my understanding, the regime targeted this religious group first and intended to eradicate them and kill them through torture, and then expand the means of the killing to organ harvesting. In this factual sequence, maybe PLC regime initially had intention to destroy the Falun Gong group, and while maintaining this initial genocidal intent, began to utilize the genocidal mechanism to produce profit at the same time. I may say the side benefit. From this point, in addition to the intent to destroy the Falun Gong, another motive could have been added. And this mixed intent actually was the point that the tribunal had a doubt on. But I think the fact that the perpetrator also made a profit does not, it negate genocidal intent. And when I looked into the earlier stage of the persecution of Falun Gong, I could find that the PRC leaders explicitly made public speeches targeting the group and specifically, and established the 610 office only to target Falun Gong, and systematically selected the practitioners, detained and tortured them to death. This was nationwide and clearly showed large-scale pattern, and the full system of this 610 office has been operating for more than 20 years till now, with consistent policy aiming at eradicating a Falun Gong group from the Chinese society. So I believe that the profit motive becomes an aggravating factor, not a defense, once the intent to destroy the group was clearly established at the earlier stage before the crime is combined with the profit-making, another mechanism. So I think this is not the case, where the main motive was economic exploitations, and that the group destruction was incidental or the secondary one. So I think the main purpose of killing these group members has been consistently from the beginning, destroying the group, and the organ harvesting was a very profitable method to reach that purpose. And since as externalized, Thank
you. For the interest of time, I'm going to call on some others. Appreciate your insight there. Katrina, I'd like to call on you as well.
Yeah, this has been a fascinating conversation, but I think in many ways, perhaps not as helpful when we try to zero in on what it is we can do to confront this horror. I would have to say that, 20 years ago, genocide, the word genocide was used more sparingly, and it did in fact symbolize the ultimate evil of which a government was capable. As the use of the phrase genocide to describe lots of troubling and difficult and bad situations is thrown around more and more promiscuously, quite honestly, the impact, one way or the other, of concluding that a genocide is occurring or isn't occurring just becomes frankly less compelling. But what we, I think, in fact, need to focus on, and I appreciate Sir Geoffrey drawing an important distinction between those attempting either in a judicial sense or in a scholarly sense to establish facts versus the activists. I would certainly put myself in that category, although like Reggie, I'm a lawyer, and like others, I'm also an academic. I have both my law degree and my PhD, so I presumably wear those hats. But about this matter, I'm an activist because of the horror at what is going on. How do we go at that? How do we create unrelenting pressure? How do we raise the level of horror and shock and outrage at what this criminal CCP is doing to innocent human beings? And we need to, in a way, reground ourselves in the old playbook of the human rights movement, which was shaming, blaming, and naming the atrocities committed by offending governments. And we know that the CCP realizes how shameful and repulsive and disgusting to any normal human being their program of forced organ harvesting is. And the reason we know it is they're lying about it. They are saying, oh, well, back then, yes, we did permit it from prisoners, but now, no, now we've moved to a voluntary donation program. They are lying. And why are they lying? Because what they are doing is so shameful. So I believe that in many ways, the more productive discussion is, how do we, in a world where there is just such an overwhelming fire hose of information about everything, trivial things and tragic things coming at us on an ongoing basis, how do we raise the profile? And we owe an immense debt to Sir Geoffrey, to the judge, to others who are doing that hard, to journalists like Jan, who are doing the hard work of, yes, documenting and finding the stories and telling the stories and compiling the evidence. That is indispensable. But then those who are activists, and especially political leaders, have to then figure out, how do we move the ball? How do we weaponize China's own pride and very thin-skinned unwillingness to be shamed on the international stage? How do we weaponize that to make this a crisis for them, and hopefully a crisis internally? As this issue rises in familiarity and awareness and outrage around the world, citizens of China themselves cannot help but be appalled and revolted and disgusted by the conduct of their government. Not everybody in China obviously is complicit in these crimes. And that also creates a vulnerability for the CCP. Any government not founded at the end of the day on the consent of the government is always something of a paper tiger, always something of a vulnerable, teetering entity. They can look very strong and very powerful, and they have tremendous systems of repression, but they do not have the consent of their population. And so I think that's, in a way, what we need to focus on, because that's how we have a chance. It's not through dry legal mechanisms. It's certainly not through United Nations mechanisms, because we know that there are real limits there as to what can be accomplished. It's through shaming them with the reality of their own deeds.
Katrina, you bring up a very good point, and I'd like to now, as we get closer to the ending and our final words, I'd like to pose a question to the panelists. What can we do to stop this genocide? What can we do to stop forced organ harvesting? What are the actionable steps that can be taken? So anyone, Jan, I see your hands there.
Yeah, I wanted to answer that directly. I mean, it's interesting because this is such a basic level of humanity. It's like we were talking about being an activist, right? I mean, raising this issue, I think the point is that I mentioned this in my kind of earlier speech, that we're in an unusual time. I think there's for whatever reason, there seems to be, I would say, an order of magnitude greater level of acceptance, of people being ready to say, yes, I accept this is happening. That was the biggest problem for many years. It truly was. I mean, but that has somehow shifted. So the plausibility question for society seems to have shifted, which is incredibly, and it's an incredibly powerful moment. I mentioned there's, multiple pieces of legislation in the US that have actually passed, one of the houses. Two of them are in the Senate, one is in committee in the House. There's a bunch in the that have been passed by the states, and multiple ones that are coming up again. So I think that you want to talk about, naming and shaming. The Falun Gong Protection Act, S817, my thumbs up is coming up there. That's something that activists could very much use. I have no idea about how bills are actually passed, to be perfectly honest, ultimately. And I know that there's certainly the Chinese Communist Party is working very, very hard to prevent the Falun Gong Protection Act from being passed, because then it will become law that the CCP is doing this. That is a very powerful message. Similarly, as the China Tribunal established the facts in an incontrovertible way, right? Now you have legislation that says, by force of law, this needs to be reported on. We're going to sanction people who are involved. There's other elements in there. There's also the Stop Forced Organ Harvesting Act, which would be an excellent, I think, another piece in the process. But the second part would be using the tools of breaking through the Great Firewall of China to help the Chinese population actually learn of these atrocities, right? As Dr. Lanto-Sweat mentioned, of course, the CCP does not have the consent of the government, but what they have a massive propaganda system that, basically keeps a lot of the most egregious information out, or people, the propaganda works for some of the population, but breaking through that firewall, getting some of these really important, bits of information that the US has passed laws around this, right? Very specifically, that this is real, I think could be incredibly powerful. So, I think the tools exist there. There's legal, I think the power of law in the US passing, I think it's a very, very good route. But, this is, I'm talking from a vantage point where that this is not an area that I have a lot of expertise in, like getting legislation passed and so forth.
Thank you, Jan. So again, the question is, how can we stop forced organ harvesting? Mrs. Kaminski, I see your hand.
Thank you. Well, a lot of things have already been done, and done very well. If I look at the United States, what you have just told us, Jan, so these are things that we should take as a model for Europe, for instance. I think that the European Union should start trying to think of their own Falun Gong Protection Act. We should focus on these things on a different level, European jurisdiction. So see what has worked in other countries, use successful stories like that from the United States as models for other countries, or even the European Union. And then what we really need is have a look at history. What was it exactly that made people think and change? Terrible human rights violations, like in South Africa, where you had apartheid, like the civil rights movement in the United States. And you realize that it is almost always a champion, somebody who rises up, who is a very charismatic character and who speaks for these people. So you had King in the United States, you had Nelson Mandela in South Africa. Then in other situations, you had simply celebrities who started to step up. So what I think would be helpful is if we identified champions who would decide to speak up for the issue, who would decide to speak up for the Falun Gong, for those who are killed at the hands of the Chinese government. If we could identify both in politics and in civil society champions who could pave the way for us, who could work like trailblazers, so to speak, that would be extremely helpful, because that would turn what we're doing here now. I'm trying to encourage you here. This is already great. There's such a very good network already of people working at all these different issues. Look at you guys here, from different nationalities, from different professions, from all sorts of walks of life, So there's a lot already there. Now let's see whether we can find and identify champions in politics, celebrities, somebody who is a trailblazer, and then pass all the information they need onto them, and let's get started.
Great points. Thank you. I'd like to let Carlos speak as well.
The first, under my point of view, is to clarify that China is not the CCP. So the most important thing is not just to clarify the truth to Chinese people. To all those people who have been collaborating with the Chinese Communist Party in Western society. Not just politicians, but also the medical community and a lot of institutions that have commercial interests with the CCP. The first message is decouple from the CCP. It doesn't matter how much money he offers you. It doesn't matter the threats. Your future cannot be linked to the CCP. What else can we do? From the medical point of view, we would have to create a massive information to all official institutions, all medical institutions in every single country. You cannot train Chinese doctors. You cannot invite Chinese doctors to give conferences or speeches in the West, because that is collaborate with the forced organ harvesting. Also in the legal community, we need to impose legislation to persecute, to condemn. To any Chinese citizen responsible for these crimes visiting any country. And most important of all, in our heart, all people in this panel, all people listening to this webinar, we all have a responsibility. And it is to actually publicize and tell about this genocide, about this crime that is happening in any place and any forum we can participate in. We really need to tell the truth about what is happening in China. Why the CCP was successful for 26 years. He was brainwashing his own population during 3 generations. And he's been lying and deceiving and manipulating Western society with lies and with commercial economic interests. We have to break
time. I should jump in now. Thank you very much. Yeah, great, excellent points. I'll call on one more person and then we're going to have our closing final statements here. Sir Nice, please. Oh, you're muted.
I'm sorry to take more of your time, but it is really important to understand that focusing on genocide as opposed to provable crimes is counterproductive and often unhelpful. Now, Kim Song is absolutely right to take the judgment and say you can go further. That's what we provided it for, if people could do that. But when she says that finding of genocide will make governments act, it does exactly the reverse. No government in the last 75 years, so far as I know, has made a pronouncement of genocide under the undertaking of Article 1 of the Convention and saying that it's acting in consequence of that finding. No government. And they will do anything, governments, to avoid being compelled by a law to take a step. So, for example, in 1994, both the British government and the American government forbade the use of the word genocide for what was clearly a genocide in Rwanda, because they said in terms, and the evidence is uncontrovertible, that if you use the word genocide, you have to act. So you, our staff, will not use the word and we will not have to act. And the British government has been resolute in avoiding using the word. And you've also got the evidence before you. In the Uyghur Tribunal, we made one very modest finding of genocide. It has not been picked up by anybody. The British government refuses to say we are correct. The Uyghur Tribunal judgment has been helpful in many ways. But my goodness, the China Tribunal government, as we've heard from what's happened in the legislatures in the United States, has been more effective. Why? Because it establishes facts that you can ram down government's throats and they cannot challenge. Whereas as soon as you start arguing about genocide, you give them a possibility of saying, no. And then you've lost your point. Proving facts that governments have to accept is, in my view, a critical way forward. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for that final point. I think we all had some really great ideas. I'm really impressed with what was said, and just a fantastic discussion here. So I want to thank you all. On behalf of DAFOH and all of the live audiences watching in, I'd like to sincerely thank our speakers for this vibrant roundtable discussion that expanded our insights and understanding. These conversations are crucial to move the needle for change and to bring an end to this horrible and shameful crime against humanity. Again, a most sincere thank you to all of our panelists, and we hope that you who joined us in this session live will help us to break the silence by sharing what you've learned with others, and so that we can bring an end to forced organ harvesting. We all wish to see positive change in this world, and we must hold accountable those whose actions could never bear the light of day. Within all of us is a desire to see humanity move towards goodness and stand on the right side of history. Thank you all, and good night.